December 12th, 1985. Gander, Newfoundland, Canada. An international charter flight carrying soldiers coming home from a deployment in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt would become the victims of a tragic accident, depending on what you believe. Aero Air Flight 1285, carrying a total of 248 people on board, most of which were U.S. Army service members, returning home to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. On December 12, 1985, Aero Air would be getting ready for the last leg of its journey home and would take off from a fuel pit stop in Gander, Newfoundland. The plane struggled to gain altitude after liftoff and started descending after takeoff. Aero Air Flight 1285 would smash into trees shortly after and would be rapidly ripped apart and scattered throughout the Canadian wilderness, not far from the Trans-Canadian Highway. In what would become the most deadly aviation accident in Canada's history, would subsequently start up a cascade of rumors, conspiracies, and even implications of a possible cover-up. From supposed ice buildup, to a glow sighted underneath the aircraft, to even terrorist groups claiming responsibility, we have a legitimate crisis. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore one of the deadliest aviation disasters in history, and the controversies surrounding it. What was the true cause of the crash that would claim the lives of all 256 staff and passengers on board? Today we dive into the disaster of Aero Air Flight 1285. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you're checking out the show, first I want to say thank you very much, and if you're listening on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out within the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. If you're listening to the show on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. Feel free to follow me over on Instagram and TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown as well to keep up to all things this show. Now, today on the show, we are back with another aviation disaster, and as fascinating as I find these stories of aviation-related instances, they always seem to stick with you because of how significant they are in history, especially the ones where there is just tremendous loss of life, much like the one we're going to talk about today. Now, this story seems to be one of the more controversial aviation accidents in recorded history for a variety of reasons, some of which include the way the aircraft crashed and the accident itself, the passengers on board of the aircraft, and then uncertainty surrounding the investigation into this disaster, and then ultimately the pure lack of information that investigators had while investigating this accident, all of which we're going to dive into in this episode. So with that all being said, how today's episode is going to go is that we are first going to set the stage a little bit with our plane in question and Aero Air in general, and its history leading up to roughly 1985, as that is a company, Aero Air, that, might not sound familiar to a lot of people. We're going to talk about it a little bit before we dive into the pure meat of the episode. Then, of course, we're going to explore the accident itself and the fallout from that accident and the controversy surrounding it, and then dive into theories and my own personal opinions and my own theory about the disaster that would be the crash of Aero Air Flight 1285. But with that being said, our story begins with Aero Air. Aero Air was a passenger plane service as well as doing some cargo transports, and it was established in 1981 and was headquartered in Miami, Florida. It was the most recent version of George Batchelor's company that he originally started in California in the late 1940s. Aero Air, even though Batchelor viewed it as a spiritual successor to Aero Airways, which only ran from 1946 to 1951, the two were very much separate entities. Aero Air in 1984 was running numerous passenger flights, mostly restricted to the eastern coast of the United States and in the Caribbean. During this time, they were not crazy profitable, and they actually had to change some of their flight offerings because of their fares being so low compared to the other airlines. However, the company would get a sizable investment when Arrow Air, who were operating with mostly McDonnell Douglas DC-8s and DC-10s at the time, would win a contract with the US government as a cargo service. They would win a $13.8 million contract, and while that would only be a rather small kind of drop in the bucket in the grand picture of their business, the cargo and transport contract would realistically be good for business. Perhaps one of the more notable portions of this contract that they would be involved in was another contract that they would sign in October of 1985, where they agreed to transport soldiers stationed within the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt as part of a multinational group of soldiers within the United Nations peacekeeping forces. Now, the United States, of course, had a group of soldiers stationed on the Sinai to help with this peacekeeping effort between a combined group of countries after signing the 1978 Camp David Accords, which led to increased peace in the Middle East at the time after Israel and Egypt had signed a peace treaty. Now, these soldiers that were stationed on the Sinai would often rotate out after certain periods of time so that it was not just one sole unit stationed there all the time. Arrow Air was one of the contractors who would transport these U.S. soldiers to and from the Sinai. Since Arrow Air really only had Douglas DC-8s and DC-10s, these planes had to be refueled and did not have the fuel capacity to travel from the United States to Cairo, Egypt in one flight, and thus had to refuel multiple times along the way. This batch of troops that Arrow Air was on its way to pick up at the time from the Sinai were members of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division, perhaps one of the most notable Army battalions in United States history. The 101st Airborne played a pivotal role in D-Day in the Battle of the Bulge, as well as numerous other battles during World War II, and even in another notable conflict within the Vietnam War in 1969 during the Battle of Hamburger Hill. Arrow Air Flight 1285's job was to pick these soldiers up and transport them from Cairo back home to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Now, for Arrow Air Flight 1285 to make it back to Fort Campbell, they had multiple layovers. Like I mentioned, the DC-8s did not have the fuel capacity to make it all in one trip, so this would cause there to be, like I said, multiple layovers and multiple stops. One in Cologne, Germany, and the other in Gander, Newfoundland, Canada. And then from Gander, they would travel back home to Fort Campbell. Because of these multiple refueling stops, there would be multiple flight crews that would shift in and out of the flight, some covering just the inbound and outbound segments of the Cairo flight, and the other group covering the remainder of the trip home to Fort Campbell. Now, the final tally for the return flight home to Fort Campbell was 248 passengers and 8 crew members. A large majority of them were members of the 101st Airborne Division. 3 of the crew members were of the flight crew: Captain John Griffin, who was 45, First Officer Joseph Connolly, who was also 45, and Flight Engineer Michael Fowler, who was 48. Now, according to one source I found, the DC-8 that Arrow Air Flight 1285 was not exactly the cream of the crop, and it had a lot of cosmetic defects, from the interior being very outdated to some supposed issues with some minor mechanical issues, none of which seemed to affect the overall operation of the airplane. However, on the surface, these issues probably should have been addressed. Now, eventually the flight would leave Cairo en route for the first leg of the journey to Cologne, Germany, and no issues were reported with the airplane at that time. They had noted that the number 4 engine had a high exhaust temperature, but this seemed to be a known issue with the plane, and not something that seemed to alert any of the Arrow Air flight crew. Eventually, the flight would land in Cologne, and the new flight crew, consisting of Griffin, Connolly, and Fowler, would arrive and take over the flight for the remainder of the journey back to the United States. Eventually, the flight would take off from Cologne that early morning of December 12th, and would also appear to have no issues, and would land in Gander, Newfoundland, Canada at 5:34 a.m. Now, the weather in Gander would not be particularly bad by any means, but was a little overcast, with some light snow and freezing rain. Now, at this point, Flight 1285 would be on the ground for a little over an hour, doing the refueling and safety checks for the next leg of the flight. Now, there was some ice buildup that would be noted by the tower in Gander, and the Gander airport did have services available to de-ice the plane, and there had been 2 flights who had left out of Gander before Flight 1285, and one plane chose to de-ice and the other did not, and neither plane had any issues on takeoff from Gander. Now, after this short delay checking the plane and refueling, the crew of Flight 1285 chose not to de-ice the plane. While getting ready for takeoff, there was a slight change in the runway plans for Flight 1285, and they were ordered to take off from the junction of runway 13 and runway 22, as the original runway that Flight 1285 was going to take off from had not been cleared of some snowfall that had occurred earlier. Now, even though there was the sudden runway change, this still gave Flight 1285 plenty of runway length still, and takeoff should not have been an issue. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Flight 1285 would begin liftoff from Gander, its acceleration normal, and would take off from the runway. But at this point, mere seconds after taking off, the plane would struggle to gain altitude. It would be flying a mere feet above the trees at the end of the runway, and would still not be able to maintain any lift and ascend higher into the sky. Flight 1285 would continue flying through the air, or attempting to fly, I should say, and it would cross over the Trans-Canadian Highway just above the ground and passing cars below, and then the airplane would clip the tops of trees, slightly break apart, and slam into the forest below, and would erupt into a gigantic fireball. The plane cut through the trees and forests like a hot butter knife, and the plane would be completely shredded to pieces. Debris would be scattered everywhere, as when the plane collided with the ground, the fuselage broke apart in multiple places, leaving a very large and spread out crash site. Now, back at the Gander airport, the crash alarm would be sounded, and firefighters and first responders would rush to the scene of the crash site. When the first responders would arrive, they would find pieces of debris spread out over 1,300 feet. Chunks of unrecognizable plane parts were everywhere, and the state of the accident was grim. Very few portions of the plane were even anywhere close to being intact, and the ones that were contained to larger fireballs in a field of burning brush and forest debris. First responders would work throughout that early morning, digging through the fires to try and find survivors of the crash. However, they had no luck. All 256 passengers and crew had died in the crash. Now, I highly encourage everyone who is able to check out the archival footage from the accident scene of this plane crash. It is quite the scene, and like I said, if this is something that, you're not comfortable doing, totally understand, but some of you who might be interested in this type of thing, if you want to check out the archival footage, like I said, I highly encourage you do so. But you can fully see, once you take a look at the archival footage, the extent in which debris was spread throughout the scene and how much trees were cut and basically sliced through from the accident. Now, it would not take long for air crash investigators to get involved, and of course the United States was invited and involved with the investigation, but a majority of it was handled by the CASB, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, which was in its relative infancy at the time. The CASB had only existed as an agency for a couple of years before this accident took place, and before that, any aviation-related disasters were handled by another aviation safety board that also handled other aviation-related fields, and thus the Canadian government thought that there could be a conflict of interest, and couple that with some mishandling of other investigations, the Canadian government opted to institute a new independent body for investigating aviation safety, and thus the CASB was born out of that. Now, of course, the initial question on everyone's mind could have been a variety of different things. Why did this plane suddenly fall out of the sky, for lack of a better terms, after flying on numerous flights before this, and now suddenly the plane has issues? It was strange, to say the least. The initial theories about the crash were all over the place, and of course this will factor into the investigation and theories that we will talk about here in a little bit. But you had other investigators at the scene as well. You had the CASB, the US government, you had Aero Air investigative personnel, and investigators from McDonnell Douglas, the airplane manufacturer, all trying to figure out what went wrong. Now, the investigators did have somewhere to start with. It was apparent based on the eyewitness testimony of those who were in Gander Tower, as well as the people driving on the Trans-Canadian Highway, that the airplane struggled to gain altitude. This was a known fact, as it didn't make it much higher than the trees themselves before ultimately smashing into the forest below. When investigators would interview eyewitnesses and the crash site, and by investigating the crash site, they were able to determine the angles in which the plane crashed and hit the ground, and when kind of compiling all of this information, they discovered the angle of the aircraft was roughly 21 degrees kind of off-center, and the aircraft was descending at roughly 12 degrees. With the aircraft, this would make the aircraft nose being actually slightly pointed up and much higher than it was supposed to be. And given this kind of weird angle in which the plane was descending but the nose was very much up and pointed up, this would actually cause the engines of the DC-8 to stall. And that the 21 degrees that the plane was kind of offset while it was descending is very much over the stall threshold of the aircraft by a significant margin. So, what does this mean? Unfortunately, it means that it sealed the flight's fate at that point. With the extreme angle of the nose of the aircraft, the engines would have stalled, and at that point the plane would have lost power to the engines completely. However, the airplane stalling would and could not have been the so-called cause of the crash. During takeoff, the plane would not have been over that 21 degree threshold as long as the plane was able to sustain the right airspeed. So, what does all this fancy mumbo-jumbo that I'm saying mean? In summary, the plane should not have just stalled by itself, and there must have been other contributing factors to start to figure out what possibly these factors could have been. The investigators needed to locate the cockpit voice recorder and the flight recorder. Both would be inside the airplane's black box. So again, at this point, it is discovered that the engines were stalled as the aircraft was basically descending. But the airplane actually lifted up into the ground, and the nose of the airplane would be kind of not over this 21 degree threshold, so the engines wouldn't have stalled by themselves, and like I said, there must have been another contributing cause, and this led investigators, like I mentioned, to the flight recorder and the airplane black box. Now, the black box did survive the crash. However, when investigators went to review the information on the cockpit voice recorder, hoping to get some semblance of what could have happened in the moments leading up to the accident, they were unfortunately in for a disappointment. The cockpit voice recorder on board Flight 1285 had suffered some form or some type of malfunction, and the investigators were not able to decipher or hear if anything had actually been recorded in the cockpit leading up to the accident. Next came the flight recorder, which was also not helpful with the overall investigation. Now, this flight recorder was originally installed when the plane was first built back during the 60s, and it didn't work completely proper either. The recorder was not capable of recording valuable data that would have helped the investigators and their current status of the investigation at this time into figuring out why the engines could have stalled in the first place. The recorder did not record the pilot's inputs, pitch control, or engine power, all of which were not recorded because this flight recorder was so primitive and not updated and kind of didn't already work. Because the information they had was so minimal, they had to jump through a lot of hoops just to get the basic information and had to convert information found on the flight recorder reel into units and then calibrate it to get a rough timeline of events. However, through this legwork, they were able to discover more clues about what could have happened to the plane. Through doing all of this advanced math that I could not even begin to explain to you that investigators did with the flight recorder and the information that they did have on the flight recorder, they were able to find that Flight 1285 lifted off from the runway at Gander at approximately 167 knots and would lift off 51 seconds into the takeoff sequence. The airspeed would increase to 172 knots a few seconds after takeoff, and then start decreasing after that, plunging down to 140 knots and struggling to ascend before ultimately crashing. What investigators were able to connect was that Flight 1285 took off much farther down the runway than it was realistically supposed to, and that it was traveling at a much higher airspeed than what would have normally been needed to achieve lift. This then led investigators to thinking that the reason the flight must have taken off much later than anticipated was due to extra weight on board the plane. Of course, if you have extra weight weighing something down, it does not take a mechanical engineer to make an estimate that more weight holding something down equals needing more propulsion to get it up. Since Flight 1285 was traveling much faster and took off much later down the runway, since when it was supposed to, if the weight numbers were accurate, this led to the prediction that something was on board the plane that could have added excess weight that was not on the flight manifest or was recorded for in the original report. Now, while one set of investigators were convinced that weight could have contributed to the idea of causing the plane crash and the plane not being able to ascend properly, other investigators started going down the rabbit hole that a bomb on board of the aircraft was responsible for the plane going down. And keep this note in the back of your head, as this becomes a major counterpoint in this story and this investigation going forward. Now, portions of the plane would be sent out to a Canadian forensic team to search for bomb residue. They also looked for wreckage that came before the crash site. If a bomb exploded on board of the plane, pieces of the plane would have been found before the crash site. However, no evidence of debris would be found before the flight's impact and slide into the forest, and no bomb residue would be found on the pieces of the plane that were sent in for forensic testing. Again, keep those notes in the back of your head for now. Now again, before we talk about the investigators going down the weight rabbit hole for just a second, investigators also considered two other possibilities: the sudden runway change for the plane being a factor, and the possibility of engine failure on board the flight. However, a runway change would not have been a major game changer in this story. Even though the runway change was sudden, the runway still had plenty of distance to realistically give the plane plenty of lift for proper takeoff, and like we just established, it didn't seem like the distance of the runway was the problem. It appeared to be the issue of the plane generating lift after takeoff. If all of the information was correct, like weight for example, the runway would have still provided plenty of takeoff room, even though it, I believe, was a touch shorter than the initial runway they were scheduled to take off from. So, in conclusion, this cannot be considered a major player in the flight's crash. Next up is the engine failure theory. However, while the initial assessment was that engine failure could have contributed to the crash, upon investigation of the engines and engine fragments that they were able to recover from the crash site, the engines were found with tree debris inside of all four engines, meaning that the engines were running, albeit stalled at the time when they struck the trees, meaning that engine failure could not have contributed to the crash of Flight 1285. Now this has us circling back to the weight theory and investigation. While inspecting the load sheet for Flight 1285, which was within the offices of Gander Airport, the load sheet specified the weight of the aircraft at 330,625 pounds, or for you international or Canadian folk, 150,000 kilograms. Now, if the weight was more than what was on the load sheet, this could account for the longer than average takeoff. This thought process would lead to more number crunching for the investigators to figure out whether or not there could have been a weight issue with the plane. Firstly, the investigators looked into the cargo on board and all of the belongings that were brought on the plane by every soldier. As it turns out, the soldiers themselves had so much gear they tried to get on the plane back in Cairo, they actually had to leave some of it behind. 41 duffel bags worth of equipment had to be left behind in Cairo, and when it was all said and done, they had miscalculated the amount of weight of the items in the cargo hold by roughly 1,000 pounds. Now, while this is significant, this 1,000 pounds cannot be the sole reason, as even just the 1,000 to 2,000 pounds would not have had the effect on the plane compared to kind of what happened with the crash. Now, the plane being overweight by 1,000, 2,000 pounds, significant, but not significant enough to basically cause what we have here, and that being this massive explosion and crash. Now, the biggest red flag would come when the investigators would take a look at the weight of the passengers on board the airplane. Now, Aero Air themselves used a personal assessment of roughly 170 pounds per person on board the flight. And this was just Aero Air's basically standard estimate when they used to calculate basically how much weight they can put on a plane. Now, this would account for an average body weight of 165 pounds per person and an additional 5 pounds per person in handheld items. Now, you might be wondering if that seems very light, and you would be correct. However, on commercial flights, you have men, women, children, infants, and the elderly, all who weigh sometimes a little over that number and sometimes a lot under that number. And thus, 170 pounds is an average for the whole plane. Now, if you do that math, that would account to 42,500 pounds, roughly, for all passengers and personal items. However, Flight 1285 was mostly military men who weighed a lot more than this 170 pounds threshold. Now, Aero Air stated within their own company rules that if there was any reason to suspect that passengers could weigh more than the average, to take manual weights. But from what I could find, according to one source, Aero Air did not provide the method to do that, and this left it in kind of a gray area when it came to pilots and the crew suspecting that the average passenger weight could exceed 170 pounds. Now, while the weights of the soldiers were measured before leaving Cairo, it actually averaged out to about 164 pounds per person, which is a little lighter than I personally expected. However, the big kicker comes when you realize that these soldiers have gear they keep on their person. You are talking weapons, kit and gear, and other military items, as well as their own personal belongings. On average, it equaled out to an additional 50 pounds per person who boarded the flight. Now, investigators did some quick math, and with this new 220 pound per person estimate, this would kick out a weight that was around 12,000 additional pounds that were not accounted for on the load sheet. Aero Air Flight 1285 was flying with roughly 12 to 14,000 pounds of additional weight that was not accounted for or documented. Now, this started turning the gears of the investigators. While the weight is significant and could have factored into the crash, it could have not have been the sole contributor. After all, the plane flew from Cairo to Cologne and from Cologne to Gander with no issues. Why would the weight issues suddenly pose an issue now? That's because weight wasn't the only contributor. Remember earlier when we said that Flight 1285 did not de-ice while in Gander? Now, at this time, while the effects of de-icing a plane, those are commonplace now. Planes do that pretty much whenever they enter an atmosphere that has kind of the buildup or ice and kind of things like that. And planes are inspected for things like that. Back in 1985, this wasn't necessarily commonplace. Investigators knew the risk of ice buildup on planes, but not every aviation professional was aware of the risk that ice buildup caused when it came to kind of airplanes and their operation. Now, Aero Air crash investigators would state in their report, surface roughness, and this is a quote, surface roughness caused by ice, frost, snow, or even large accumulations of insect debris or badly chipped paint can be sufficient to cause significant decreases in lift production and increases in drag. And like I said, that was from the Aero Air crash investigators' own report. Now, while the weather at the time of Flight 1285's landing into Gander at around 5:30 that morning, like I said, it was a mix of light freezing rain and light snow at the airport. And the weather observer at the Gander airport noticed some mild ice buildup on their testing sheet that was outside in the elements at the airport. Now, like I mentioned, the flights that had come into Gander before 1285, the two flights that did report various different levels of ice accumulation. And one flight did choose to de-ice in Gander, and one did not, and both had no issues during takeoff. However, neither of those flights were 12 to 14,000 pounds overweight either. Now, given the weather conditions, and the fact that Flight 1285 would have accumulated ice on the descent into Gander, it pretty much made it a foregone conclusion that the plane had accrued some ice buildup. It was also not common practice for the flight crew during that time to check for ice on the wings, or at least very, very small ice buildup on the wings that could have been clear and not visible at first glance. Now, even something as small as 1 millimeter of ice buildup on the wings would have been enough to produce the lack of drag that the airplane experienced before the crash. At the time, like I mentioned, very little was known about small ice accumulation on airplanes. Many had been known to check for large chunks, but with thin sheets of ice buildup in the plane, it's actually a lot heavier than you would think it looks. Even small, thin layers of ice have been known to affect the lift of an aircraft by an exponential margin. Investigators would test this theory within a flight simulator to simulate ice buildup with the added weight of the plane, this 12 to 14,000 pound number, and every time they ran this flight simulator, it would end with the engine stalling out and the plane crashing. Now, This would have caused the pilots at this point, in the flight simulator, if you're in the seats of the pilots operating Aero Air Flight 1285, natural instinction of the pilots would have caused them to try to pull the aircraft upwards to try and generate lift. However, that would make it arguably worse because of the added weight the plane had. However, while this seems like pretty much a slam dunk, and that this is kind of what happened, you have the flight simulator, the ice buildup, the added weight, not everyone was satisfied with this weight in ice theory. Some other investigators were convinced that there must have been an ulterior motive, and that the plane was brought down by a bomb. They cite accident crash photos of large puncture holes expelling outwards from the wreckage of the plane, which could have been caused by exploding debris flying outwards from the plane. Another chunk of information would be found within the autopsy of the victims, where very high levels of carbon dioxide was found within the lungs of the victims of the crash, thinking that perhaps they breathed in some type of carbon expellent from an explosive device. However, both of these subpoints could be explained. The outward puncture-like holes in the plane are fairly common in airplane crashes because of the equipment on board the plane being forced outward from the force of a collision. It's like what happens when you get into a car crash at high speeds and you aren't wearing your seatbelt. You go out the window. This is what would happen in these instances, if you understand my analogy. In addition, portions of the plane, like I mentioned, were sent out to a Canadian forensic team to search for bomb residue, and they didn't find any. And like I also mentioned, they searched for wreckage that came before the crash site, and none would be found. Like I said, no debris found before the crash site, and no bomb residue would be found either. Now, the carbon monoxide inhalation of the victims would have been present because of the extreme amount of fire that was present during the crash, because after all, this plane just had gotten refueled. So when it smashed the ground, there was a monumental explosion because you had thousands of gallons of fuel basically all igniting at the same time. You had thousands of gallons of fuel burning. Now, that would be only reasonable to assume that in the victims of the crash, even if they were barely alive at this point, or unfortunately passed away due to burns, they would have inhaled carbon monoxide from the burning fires, not from a type of exhaust from an explosive on board the plane. Those, however, who liked the bomb theory proposed a couple other areas of thought. Red paint was found within an engine piece of the crash. Now, this was originally looked at as an example or a possibility of outside influence, like an explosive device on board the plane. However, a front-end loader used to clear the debris from the crash site was red, and it is of course very easy for metal to scrape together and for paint residue to get left behind. They also proposed the idea of the glow seen by witnesses on the Trans-Canadian Highway, stating that they saw a bright glow coming from underneath the plane. In terms of the glow underneath the aircraft, investigators also state that this could have been easy to explain, as when the engines would be stalling, you would get a compressor stall, which would be accompanied by some flames coming out from the engines of the airplane. Both of these side points that the bomb theorists proposed are seemingly debunked. However, that would not stop them, and we will get to that here in a little bit. However, perhaps one of the biggest contributors to this conspiracy of the bomb theory would be Aero Air themselves. Originally, they were very much against the idea of being blamed for some type of mechanical fault, because ultimately, this would have fallen into their shoulders, as you could have imagined, and their investigators would point to those outward holes found in the plane wreckage as evidence of some type of bomb. However, while that would be something that would be found within kind of a bomb exploding, no other evidence would be found, and like I mentioned, the lack of bomb residue debunks the bomb theory entirely, in my personal opinion. But at the time, of course, Aero Air was trying to clear themselves of any wrongdoing, or wrongdoing that they could control, basically. Eventually, over the course of several years, the crash investigators would present their findings to the CASB. Now, the official theory that was provided to the cause of the crash would be the ice and weight theory, that with the ice on the airplane significantly affecting the airspeed and causing excess drag on the airplane, coupled with the fact that the airplane was significantly overweight, that these were the main factors in the crash. However, Not everyone was convinced with this analysis. 4 of the 9 members of the board disagreed with the findings of the crash investigators, and they believed that a blast on board of the plane caused the crash. Now, these 4 members of the board would even create their own dissenting report contradicting the findings of the ice and weight combo. To add a little context, this minority dissenting report was a fraction of the size of the majority report and, quite frankly, flew in the face of common fact at the time compared to what investigators had found during their analysis of the crash. Now, because of these conflicting reports, this would cause there to not be an official cause of the crash that would be able to be determined. Now, to this day, there is a widely accepted theory and conclusion as to what happened. However, this uncertainty, and basically the fact that they offered the victims of the crash with absolutely zero closure. They took 3 years of investigation just to claim something happened, that being the bomb theorists, while not providing any real evidence to back it up, and thus, because of this, and because the board could not come to a decision, there would not be an official explanation given to any of the victims of the family, or any official explanation even given to this day. It would basically still be qualified as undetermined. Now, in the eyes of the Canadian government, you have 2 sides basically bickering over what happened. One side, using a lot of facts in science and research and investigative just common investigative work, proposes a very smart and logical theory. The other side proposes this bomb theory, which, again, I have no problem with a good old-fashioned conspiracy theory about a bomb blowing something up. However, there's absolutely zero evidence to prove that, and the other investigators pretty much disproved that because they did all the legwork to rule that out as a possibility. Because of this bickering, and because the board could not agree, in the eyes of the Canadian government, this would be a fiasco of epic proportions. Eventually, because of this, the CASB would even be disbanded, and a new Safety Bureau for Aviation would be established for Canada. The fact that the CASB could not come to an agreement about the result of the crash caused the general public in Canada to have an immense amount of distrust. Like in the eyes of the public, these are the people who investigate these tragic accidents, and they cannot even agree on what happened and basically fought about it. The split theories and controversy blinded the ability for an accurate prediction of the crash itself, and thus caused the total upheaval of the CASB entirely. Now, to perhaps make the entire dissenting report look even worse and make the CASB board feel even worse after this tragic accident, fast forward to March of 1989 in Dryden, Ontario. A Fokker F-28 jet aircraft would choose not to de-ice during a layover stop. Air Ontario Flight 1363 departed Dryden, Ontario, and shortly after takeoff, nearly identical to Flight 1285, the plane struggled to maintain lift, lost altitude, and crashed shortly after leaving the runway. The airplane would hit the tree line and smash into the ground and would explode because of the sheer amount of fuel on board. The crash would kill 28 of the 69 people on board. Now, the official explanation: the buildup of ice and snow on the wings affected the lift of the aircraft, and it was not able to climb an altitude, causing it to crash mere 49 seconds after takeoff. This event, in a way, was a brutal reminder of Aero Air Flight 1285, as it was almost identical. And if the CASB could have agreed on the findings of the majority report, this accident of Air Ontario Flight 1363 probably could have been prevented entirely. But with that being said, that concludes the overall story of Aero Air Flight 1285. You have these 2 sides of the aisle bickering about what could happen, and you have one side, like I mentioned, that presents a lot of facts and logic, and the other side that pretty much had all their points disproven. However, they weren't going to take no for an answer, and because of this constant bickering, you have an undetermined result now in the present day. Of course, you have the widely believed theory, which is going to be our first theory that we're going to talk about here, and that is weight and ice buildup. Now, like I mentioned, this is the widely accepted theory on the surface, and this also seems to be the most plausible and probable theory. The miscalculation of the weight, coupled with the buildup of ice and the crew choosing not to de-ice the plane, even if it seemed to be a small amount at the time, was enough to tip the flight over the edge and cause the crash. Pretty self-explanatory. We talked about this pretty much the entire episode. Now, the second theory, which kind of teeters more on the line of conspiratorial, is the undisclosed cargo theory. And this is another theory proposed that maybe some of the additional weight on board the plane was due to some undisclosed cargo on board the aircraft. Now, the evidence here is mostly speculatory, and from what I was able to find in my research, it did not appear that anything was found during the crash that would point to the idea that the United States was transporting something back to the US that was not originally accounted for. Now, this theory is sometimes floated around because of possibly the hottest news story and controversy going on at the time, and that being the Iran-Contra affair. Now, if you are unaware of what the Iran-Contra affair was, let me give you a little history lesson and a little background. The Iran-Contra affair was a scandal that rocked the U.S. government. In 1985, Iran and Iraq were at war with one another, and the Iranian government sought the purchase of weapons and arms from the United States, even though there was a strict policy against doing so. National Security Advisor Robert McFarland approached President Ronald Reagan with an idea. McFarland thought that selling arms to Iran would improve the U.S. relations with Iran in the broader Middle East. President Reagan, however, was overall more concerned about 7 American hostages that were held captive by Iranian terrorists in Lebanon. This built on the possibility of the United States dealing guns to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages. However, Reagan had built his campaign on not negotiating with terrorists, and this would be a direct U-turn from that campaign promise. In summary, the plan would move forward, because that's always how it works. However, it would not go as anticipated, which, that's just a total shocker. I would have not seen that coming at all. The United States would deal arms to Iran in exchange of 3 of the hostages to be released, just for those 3 American hostages to be replaced with 3 more hostages. Essentially, it was a lose-lose situation. When the deeper part of the financials were seen in this little kind of swap, it had been discovered that only $12 million of the $30 million the U.S. was supposed to receive from Iran actually came into the government. Now, this kind of caused a big question. Where is all of our money? This was because Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North would be funneling some of these funds made from the sales of arms to Iran to funding the Contras, an anti-communist rebel movement in Nicaragua that sought to overthrow the Sandinistas, the socialist party in power in Nicaragua during this time. Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North was giving these funds to the Contras with the backing of National Security Advisor Admiral John Poindexter, and thus a scandal erupted on whether or not President Reagan had knowledge of funding the Contras after being barred to do so from Congress. So how do these 2 events pair together? As it turns out, Aero Air Flight 1285 was in fact one of the planes used to help transport arms to the Iranians. This means that what if the United States went for something else other than the hostages in exchange for the arms that was kept secret by the CIA? While it is immensely fun to speculate about what the government has done without the public knowledge, the investigation was mostly handled by the Canadians in the crash of Flight 1285, and if the Canadians had found something within the crash, realistically you would think that they would have held on to it for investigation purposes because they're kind of acting as like the third party in this instance. It happened on Canadian soil. Canadians are overtaking the operation here to investigate the crash. However, it doesn't seem like we have that. It doesn't seem like the Canadians found anything within the crash site that would indicate that something was being hidden that the U.S. government didn't want people to find. So that leads us into the bomb theory. Now, the only thing that pairs into the bomb theory that I personally like is the fact is that the security at the Cairo airport was supposedly very relaxed. And according to those within the Minority Report, it could have been possible for an explosive device to get on board of the airplane. And in fact, the day after the flight's crash in Gander, Newfoundland, the Islamic Jihad, a branch of Hezbollah, had claimed responsibility for the bombing and the crash of Flight 1285, even though there was no evidence to support the bomb theory. The United States government would debunk this claim, which would come in from an anonymous caller to a French news agency in Beirut. Now, my thoughts would be, if I would to entertain this theory, would be perhaps maybe the Iraqi government got wind of the United States and Iran arms deal and wanted to get back at the United States for breaking their own embargo. Now, while I find that kind of compelling, no bomb residue would be found on the crash site or in the wreckage. Now, while I think that maybe it could have been covered up, like I mentioned, you had an independent group of the Canadian government, the CASB, investigating the crash. If it was a bomb, like the 4 out of 9 board members who wrote the dissenting report thought it would be, wouldn't everybody agree on that theory? You would certainly think so. In my personal opinion on this entire case, I think it's the ice and weight theory. Now, while I think that maybe the idea of there being something on board the plane that was undisclosed cargo could have been on there, we didn't find anything. And in all of the research that I did, it certainly didn't point to that direction. It didn't seem like anything was found that could have been questionable or, something that was unrecognizable or, oh, here's something that we don't really know what this is. This is a mysterious debris or a mysterious substance. That wasn't found. It seems like, given the lack of awareness on ice buildup of the plane and the gross miscalculation of how much weight was actually on the plane, these two things brought down the plane. And of course, the weight wasn't the sole contributor, and of course the flight going from Cairo to Cologne, Germany would not have caused any ice buildup. The flight coming into Cologne, or coming from Cologne into Gander, would have caused the ice buildup, as obviously you're going from Germany to Gander, Newfoundland. You're coming into some snow, maybe a little inclement weather. Of course, it's much colder. You have that ice buildup on the outside of the plane. You don't choose to de-ice, and because of all of this ice buildup, even though it doesn't look like there's any ice buildup, just because of all of the additional surface area that you've now generated on the plane, this significantly affected the lift and ultimately caused the crash of the plane. Now, while this theory isn't sexy in any way, shape, or form, this is what the evidence does point to. And it is very unfortunate that you had the CASB basically bickering like little girls over whether or not common fact took precedence over some type of conspiracy of a bomb. And that does mean something coming from me who does talk about conspiracies on a semi-weekly basis. So maybe I need to look myself in the mirror on that one. Maybe. I probably won't. I'll be a hypocrite. But in my personal theory, I think it's the ice and weight theory. It makes a lot of sense. It seems like the investigators, they did all of the legwork they possibly could do on this case to determining that more than likely this was a combination of ice buildup and weight that contributed to the crash of the airplane, and that there really is no evidence. Of course, there's no bomb residue or anything like that that would point to the possibility of there being some sort of explosive that was on board the plane or anything like that. Of course, you had a claim from a terrorist group. However, that would go nowhere and that would be debunked. Unfortunately, that leads us right back to the ice and weight theory, which I believe is the ultimate contributor in this very unfortunate case. And it is very unfortunate because if there was a little bit more awareness, and if if the CASB agreed to come to the conclusion that it was ice and weight, and there was this broader awareness that was made, maybe even the Air Ontario flight that crashed 4 years later, maybe that wouldn't have even happened. And an additional 29 people wouldn't have had to lose their lives. It's a very unfortunate circumstance, and of course, aviation disasters are a little bit of a touchy subject to talk about, and they're a little sensitive, and they're kind of difficult to talk about, but they are very important to talk about, especially when you have these crashes that have a deep-rooted conspiracy or a lot of theories surrounding them. It is important to talk about them, and I do find them very fascinating, and a very kind of fascinating piece that kind of intertwines itself within kind of general history that we have of the aviation industry, but also in different countries and so on and so forth. But I guess that's my own personal opinions, more or less. But with that being said, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode into the Aero Air Flight 1285 disaster This was an interesting one to cover. I was very fascinated with this. I tried to dig over as much as I possibly could. There was a lot of resources out there on the internet for this. So if you like to do your own research into this case, I highly encourage you do so, as well as taking a look at the archival footage. It is some pretty gruesome stuff. Of course, there's nothing too gruesome, but it is tough to look at. The sheer kind of destruction and devastation that was left behind from the crash is hard to fathom. So if that is something that does interest you, I do highly encourage you looking this up for yourself, as there is a lot of resources out there if you'd like to look this one up personally. But like I said, this is going to do it for this week's episode on the Aero Air Flight 1285 crash. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the next one.